Yes, welcome to Healing X Outreach. I'm your host, Augustine Nastasio, and welcome again for another Healing X Outreach podcast. We have as a guest this morning Dr. Paul Copan. He's the author of the book, Is God a Moral Monster? He's married to Jacqueline. They have 6 children together. He's a Christian theologian, analytic philosopher, apologist, and author. He's currently the professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University and holds the endowed Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics. He's written several books, including today's book that we're going to be discussing, that is God a Moral Monster? The other books he has written is Did God Really Command Genocide? Coming to Terms with the Justice of God. Is God a Moral Monster? Of course, Making Sense of the Old Testament God. And that's just your interpretation responding to skeptics who challenge your faith. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Paul Copan. Hello,
Thanks very
Dr.
much,
Paul
Gus. I
Copan.
appreciate it. Hi.
Yes, hello, yeah.
Glad to be on the air with you.
Yes, I'm glad to have you on today because I'm really excited about your book. And there are several reasons why I'm excited about this book that you've written. I'm on a vendetta this year, and my vendetta has to do with the Old Testament God, and that is to exonerate his name that people have been giving him. Just to let you a little history about this program, Healing X Outreach. Our motto is the place where ex-cultists speak out. Now, with that comes a lot of baggage, you would imagine, people that come out of the cults. The cult that I'm most familiar with is the one that I was born with, is the Jehovah's Witnesses. And there is a great deal of constituency of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses out there doing all types of activism against their cult, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. As there is probably with the Mormons, but I think that countercult apologetics possibly began strongly with the Jehovah's Witnesses in mind, thanks to Dr. Walter Martin and my godmother's husband, Bill Setner. And she's still living, Joan Setner. Bill Setner passed away in the 1980s, I believe. And so Joan Setner started a little group called Witnesses Now for Jesus. That was a little retreat for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. And it was unique. Some people call it the mother of all conventions for ex-cultists. And so we've had a little issue here in the XJW community. There is a growing trend of what some people call neo-Martianists. And they basically tag on the same arguments that you've encountered with new atheists. And of course, coming out of the cults, you have a great deal of atheists also. So your book tackles new atheism, but also at the same time, it's tackling a number of issues. And so this issue is, of course, they believe that the Old Testament God is so horrible, genocidal, misogynistic, racist, you name it, and you tackle all of those in this book here, and you do it well, that he has to be the devil. And that's why we call it neo-Martianism, because we know Marcion didn't believe that, the God of the Old Testament was the devil. He called him the demiurge, but nevertheless, he felt that he was not the true God. So that they carry on that same issue, but also for the same arguments that you've encountered with new atheists. And so, and there's certain things that you say in your book that I'm like amening you on, especially the beginning. Because here on this program, we've had Jesus mythicists. We've had a number of Jesus mythicists on debate. And I think some of the things that you said in your very first chapter, I think were on point. And it's funny because when I thought that I would encounter the atheists of the scholarly realm, that they would be scholarly, and you admit that neo-atheism or new atheists are not exactly scholarly in your encounters and also others' encounters with new atheists, that they've found a group of men who claim to be. Let me coin it in your book right here. It's on page 16. It says, first, for all their emphasis on cool-headed scientific rationality, they express themselves not just passionately, but angrily.
Yeah, so, that's right.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. We even had one new atheist who a debate on the issue of the resurrection just started using profanity in the middle of the debate, and he touted himself as someone who had understudied William Lane Craig, and you probably know who I'm talking about. But and a former pastor, by the way. But on the issue of the resurrection, I was shocked to find that he actually didn't know anything about the Orthodox position of the resurrection, a man who claimed to have been served as a pastor and been an understudy of William Lane Craig. So I think that your book is really great at actually attacking their arguments in a scholarly manner and with great detail and precision. I don't know if you've read Dr. David Lamb's book, but I think that your book and his book go hand in hand in two different ways. They handle this issue in two different ways. I think that you handled it with great detail as far as your knowledge concerning the ancient Canaanite, Hittite literature, the Ugaritic culture at the time, and their languages, and their codexes. I think that you did that a great job and a great service to the Mosaic Law, and comparing the Mosaic Law to the surrounding Eastern culture at that time.
Right.
What he does, David Lamb does, is he tackles the issue and comparing it to practical everyday life issues. I think you hit the nail on the head on some of the details of the issue. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this great book, this God, a Moral Monster. And I really wish that every Christian would have this book right here and Dr. Lamb's book. And it is my hopes that in the future we will actually get a couple archaeologists. And you mentioned one of them. I think it's Kitchens is one of the archaeologists you mentioned in your book.
Yeah, Kenneth Kitchen, and there's another very good one, James Hoffmeyer at Trinity Seminary in Deerfield, Illinois. Yeah. Yes.
I'm already reading Hoffmeyer's his textbook on the Old Testament, and I'm also reading his book, I think, God and Israel. So I'm reading both of those books, and I plan on having him as a guest. And I saw that you had spoke previously at EM&R, and this ministry is an affiliate of EM&R. So I'm sorry that I missed you at the conference this past year. So
no, it was a good conference, and glad to be connected with you, though.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I haven't read the entire book, but I've made so many notes. I've read half of the book now. I'm on chapter 10 going into 11. And there are certain things that you address about atheism, but I want to deal more with some of the issues that we've had encountered in the XJW community. And in the XJW community, of course, this label that the God of the Old Testament is violent and masochistic and all of these issues with him, you really you said something about the Old Testament, which I think I've known a few of these things, but you really lifted my awareness to an area that I wasn't aware of. You brought me up full scale. I love the fact that you call basically the Mosaic Law redemptive movement. And I'd like for you to tell our listeners a little bit about what you mean by redemptive movement when you're comparing the Old Testament law to its other cultures that were surrounding it.
Right. Yeah. And the redemptive movement isn't original with me, but I think it does helpfully depict what is going on that God begins where the Israelites are in a very non-ideal, fallen, corrupted culture, and meets them where they are, but also moves them in a redemptive direction through legislation that is more elevating and that keeps certain things under control, so to speak, or keeps them tempered. And so, like, for example, the issue of slavery or servitude, I think is a better word. That there are certain things that are for regulation and control. So that while there is servitude permitted, you can voluntarily do indentured servitude and so forth. There are still there's a certain mindset that is being cultivated. That the Israelites are to remember that they too were slaves or serving in the land of Egypt, and that was to shape their mindset. That their redemption was to alter the way that they were thinking. That just as God had brought them by grace out of Egypt, they were to remember their harsh servitude and be kind to those who were aliens in the land and so forth. So there are a number of, there's a shift in mindset that what God had done for them redemptively was to reshape their thinking. And many of the laws, like regarding runaway slaves from other countries, which were allowed to settle in any of Israel's cities, that Israel was to take them in rather than sending them back to their masters. And in other cultures, they had, like Hittite and Babylonian cultures, if you harbored a runaway slave, you could be punished capitally. You could be put to death because of that. Whereas if they came to Israel, they could find freedom, that they could be released from a harsh taskmaster and have a fresh start in Israel. And so, again, it doesn't mean that all the legislation is what say Jesus is bringing, but it is moving them in that direction. And so God takes into account hardened human hearts. And so Jesus says in Matthew 19:8 that Moses permitted certain things because of the hardness of human hearts. And so God permits divorce, for example, and there are other things that God permits. And God was working with a fallen culture. There's warfare, there's polygamy, there's patriarchy, and so forth. And so God is moving them in a redemptive direction, but is kind of working with the messiness on the ground.
Yeah, amen. One of the things that and it never really occurred to me until this issue came up was I've always known that, for example, the Old Testament temple sacrifices. We know when you read Hebrews chapter 9 that basically that at the Old Testament temple sacrifices, it was just simply a rehearsal. It was a rehearsal that something was going to come that was going to be better, and so they're going through this rehearsal, and it's a preparation for the Messiah, for the one true sacrifice that will truly exonerate sins, that will truly atone men for their sins. And so it was almost a means of God saying, look, this is what you're going to have to look for, and the symbolism of what was happening there. And we see that fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But what you and Dr. Lamb, but you especially in your book, by labeling it, I love the fact that we call it the redemptive movement. And because when you think of a movement, you think of a change or a gradual progression towards something. Right. And actually a progression is probably a better word for that, towards something, from something that is failing or has failed. And, one of the things is I've encountered some atheists, and one particular atheist thought, she came out of the Jehovah's Witnesses, she was shocked to find out that the Israelites actually came from a paganized culture. Abraham came from Ur. We know in Ur there was, the Akkadian civilization came from Ur, that they were surrounded around all of these pagans, and that even the language of the Hebrews was very Canaanite in its origins. And so I think it never really occurred that that there has to be a transition, that there has to be a way where they're used to a way, which was, of course, a fallen way. It was a pagan way, and it permeates the culture, and now they have to understand a new way, but God has to bring them up gradually. And I think that's what it never really occurs to people, because we think of what you mentioned is that we're thinking of the Bible in Western terms and Western culture. We're not really trying to see that the Mosaic Law and the people of the law were coming from a backward society. And I had no idea that Hammurabi's law code. First of all, I didn't know that the Mosaic Law preceded Hammurabi's law code until I read your book, which is why I need to get some archaeology, and I'm starting to read more about my Old Testament now. So it's funny because cults concentrate on the Old Testament, but I didn't realize how absent in my knowledge of the Old Testament I was until I started on this issue. But the reason why there are similarities, for example, with the Proverbs, with other cultures, for example, the Egyptians, some of their proverbs or poetic sayings are very similar to the Proverbs, and these similarities do not denigrate the fact that this is God speaking for His people and trying to bring His people upward, progressive from a time and a culture that they're used to, which is fallen. And so it takes time and it takes baby steps to get there, even though the Mosaic Law really, in comparison to the other surrounding nations, was not just baby steps, it was a huge step.
Yeah, and I would just add, there are various interpretations. Some people will say that there's various laws in the Law of Moses that are that are taken from the Code of Hammurabi. Others will say no, there's a more original source that the Law of Moses draws from, that Hammurabi draws from, and so forth. And so there are different interpretations of how that goes. But I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that, and you're right to point out that there's no denigration of the Old Testament if, say, Proverbs are taken from non-Israelite settings. Just like Paul, when he's in Athens, he's quoting Stoic philosophers, Stoic thinkers, like in him we live and move and have our being, and we are his offspring. He's not quoting the Bible. He's quoting Stoic thinkers, but he's using their words to articulate the truth, the way things are. And so again, we can take a New Testament example as well. But I think a helpful image for this is what the biblical scholar N.T. Wright says. He says that we should compare the Mosaic Law to a booster rocket, that it has a place, it has a role in getting the ship, the rocket ship, out of the Earth's atmosphere. But once the job is done, then the booster rocket is no longer necessary. And in the same way, the Law of Moses has a role to play. And he says the Law of Moses, the Torah, is given for a specific period of time and is then set aside. Not because it was a bad thing now happily abolished, but because it was a good thing whose purpose had now been accomplished. And so this is what we see about how God meets people partway between the ideal and the fallen reality on the ground, that God is moving them forward. And even in the Old Testament, we start to see that there is a certain dynamism to the Law of Moses. You see that a lot of the legislation is not intended to be permanent, because even within the Law of Moses, we see some shifts taking place. For example, in Leviticus 7, the ceremonially unclean at first can't eat meat from offerings, but then in a later text, in Deuteronomy 12, this is permitted. In an earlier legislation, a ceremonially unclean person who had come into contact with a dead body wasn't allowed to celebrate the Passover. But upon appeal, in Numbers 9, unclean persons were able to celebrate the Passover. So again, you see that sort of a development that is taking place even within the law of Moses. So I think that gives further credence to the idea that that this is something that is not meant to be set in stone, as it were, permanent for all the people of God for all time. But think of that booster rocket. It was transitional. It was something to help them to give a theological, spiritual understanding of what is going on that would help them to make sense of what the Messiah would eventually come to do and bring these things into further clarity.
Amen. Amen. And I think that's what sometimes neo-atheists, including some ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and pose an argument which actually tries to make the Mosaic Law an application for all people of all times, and it actually was a temporary provision for people of a certain time to bring them progressively to where God wants them to be, and of course, I think that you point out the fact that the Genesis account actually is a good example of where God wants humanity or his people to be at, but they had fallen they were in a fallen condition when he calls them out, and I think that's one of the things that we fail to realize. He's calling them out. So where is he calling them out from? He's calling them out from a culture and a people which are in rebellion against God, and in every single facet of their life. And if I may, I just want to read this part in page 89 for the listeners that you had written. I thought it was really a poignant statement that you made. You said, as we delve more deeply, we'll continue to affirm two things. One, certain Old Testament laws and punishments were inferior to creational ideals. That's once again what I was talking about, the Genesis. Genesis, and you quote Genesis chapter 1 and 2. You have that in parentheses. Then the Mosaic Law is not permanent, universal, and the standard for all nations. So we should evaluate the severity of harsh laws and punishments in their ancient Near Eastern context instead of in light of Western culture. Indeed, to the minds of the ancient Near Eastern peoples, we Westerners will be considered a bunch of softies. I love that. And I'll tell you why. Partially, I like that because talking about American politics, how conservatives now call liberals snowflakes, and and it's because really the issue once again is dealing with the acceptance of the law of the land, and one of the controversial, just to make this a little more practical, one of the controversial arguments in politics today is, of course, how the president is responding to the border with a law that actually permits him to separate the adults from the children, to properly identify whether if the adults are the parents of these children or are sex traffickers or some type of alien coyote that is not related to the children. And so he has every right to extend that law. The law is in place, but he's being actually accused of using the law to its fullest extent. And even though the last president also used the law, he just didn't use it to its fullest extent, and still the same scenario occurred. And so, I mean, this, I think that kind of applies to that statement about how we in Western culture would be viewed by the Eastern society and the culture of that time as a bunch of softies. And even with the Mosaic Law, they were kind of backtracking from the Near Eastern culture and its ways of life, where even thieves could absolutely be killed for stealing, according to some of the surrounding nations. And so in certain ways, the Mosaic Law was a much more humane law code for its people and for that time and for the surrounding nations. I always point out the fact that, for example, that the Israelites were well ahead of its time, and the fact that they had female judges, Deborah, in the Bible. I think that's amazing that they had women as leaders, at the time as a judge, and I think that itself, was kind of like the women's liberation of its time. You have a God who sometimes refers to himself as a mother, and yet he is father. So even though it was heavily patriarchal, and I think you mentioned it several times in this book also, particularly in chapter 10 that I'm reading on misogynism, that women were being lifted constantly in the under the veneer of the God Yahweh.
Yeah, you certainly see, whereas in certain ancient Near Eastern cultures, the mother basically was subservient to the son, the eldest son, all of her life. But you see, in the scriptures, that the son is to honor his father and his mother. Sometimes it's honor your mother and father, in reverse. But you do definitely see, of course, a very strong emphasis on the priority of persons over property in the Mosaic Law, and that's a very significant thing. That even servants, that those who are servants are not treated like a lot of people when they read about, when they read the terms, it's unfortunate translation, slavery mentioned in the Bible, or slave. It's better to be servant or even worker. Because that term slavery conjures up all sorts of negative things that were far different in the Mosaic Law. And I write in my book that if various features of the Mosaic Law would have been paid attention to in colonial America and elsewhere, if people really took their scripture seriously, then there would not have been the abuse of people like that in the slavery system. The slavery system wouldn't have been around. For example, if a master, or employer struck his servant so that he died, then this employer would himself, be subject to capital punishment, because even though he was a servant, it didn't mean you could do whatever you wanted with him. And so I go into a number of these texts and look at the emphasized humanity of those who were in service. Now, I mentioned, for example, how in Leviticus 25, where some people say, look, here's you can get these servants these slaves from other nations and so forth. Well, we're not told how they become servants from other nations. Sometimes it's through warfare, and there are refugees and so forth. How do you handle them? Well, one way was to attach that they would often attach themselves to Israelite homes because they couldn't have their own land in Israel. And so the best way to do that was to be attached to a family, and then you just kind of continued on with that family from generation to generation. But a lot of people say, look, you can acquire a slave, and it sounds like that's property. Well, it's interesting that as you keep reading the text, and people don't want to keep reading toward the end of Leviticus 25, where it says that if a stranger or alien comes to be a person of means. In other words, those same people who had been serving can actually become persons of means and actually can have an Israelite servant working for them. And it says, but then it goes on to talk about how it's not optimal, and so an Israelite relative, it'd be better to try to get him, to acquire him. The same word is used to acquire an Israelite. Does that mean the Israelite is property? No, of course not. It just uses that language of legal transactions, sort of like we use in our sports metaphors today of an owner of a team, or a person being traded, or a person being sold, or whatever. We have that kind of language, and we don't think that demeans a person. We just understand that that's the language of sports, and it's no denigration of the person.
Yeah, I was glad that you brought up the issue of slavery. I know that that's one of those, I guess, picky points by atheists and also skeptics of the Bible, is the fact that they feel that the Bible endorses slavery. But of course, when they talk about slavery, they're thinking of in terms of the slavery that was endured here in colonial America, or they're thinking about, not an indentured service, and that also slaves had certain rights, and by the time we even get to the New Testament, they're still slaves, but slaves are treated equally with their owners because it's a type of indentured service, and you mentioned that also in your book. I do wanted to talk about the is-ought fallacy, because I think that really is what a lot of people get involved in. One of the things that I've come to realize is that, and you learn this in Bible college. You learn that there are certain books of the Bible. You have books of poetry, you have books of history, and I think that the average Bible reader, to coin Gordon Fee's book, don't read the Bible for all it's worth. And what I mean by that is that they read the Bible the same way no matter what type of literature they're reading, and they don't recognize that there are different literary styles and that you need to read certain books of the Bible in a certain way. For example, books of history, you should actually read more like you read your morning Sunday newspaper. If you read about Jeffrey Dahmer, for example, and I think you use him in early on in the book, but if you read a serial killer has killed someone, you don't get mad at the newspaper writers for recording that information. You don't blame the newspaper, the Washington Post here, oh, the Washington Post, they're responsible for the deaths of all these people because they must have influenced the serial killer. And I think there is ought fallacy. And once again, I love the fact that you give provisional terms to some of these fallacies. There is ought, redemptive movement. These are really good ways to perceive certain classifications of things in the Bible. There is, explain to our listeners what is the is-ought fallacy.
Sure. Yeah, and you're right that this often comes up in historical narratives, and a lot of these new atheists like Richard Dawkins and so forth, they'll say, look at these things that are in the Bible, like Lot and his daughters and the incestuous relationship and so forth. Well, a lot of, again, that's describing what is, but it's not as though the narrator is saying, and therefore you ought to do it too, or this is what the people of God ought to be doing. In many ways, what is being described is being people with moral understanding can grasp that, no, this is not the way it ought to be done. It's simply describing the way things are. So we should not jump from is, the way things are, to ought, this is what we ought to do, or this is a duty, or it's okay for the people of God to do this. That just doesn't follow. And so we need to be careful that as we're reading historical narrative, we keep in mind that the author is not necessarily approving of what is being described here. We just simply need to take it kind of in the flow of what has happened. The Bible is kind of a no-spin zone, as it were, where it doesn't pull any punches. It just describes things, sometimes in very graphic terms, just laying out the everything, warts and all, of the situation. But it's not as though it's saying that this is the way it ought to be, and so forth, or that even some things that happen within the land of Israel are for a particular period of time. Some people think, these laws are for all time, and we've already talked about this. There is a period of time for which kosher laws, for example, or circumcision laws, etc., are in place. But we shouldn't say that this is what all of God's people ought to do into the future. In fact, it's kind of interesting that the Apostle Peter, at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, as they're talking about circumcision. Should the Gentiles be circumcised? After all, the Gentiles, the argument is that they need to become Jewish first before they become Christians. And Peter says, why do you put God to the test by placing upon the neck of the disciples a yoke which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? So even here Peter is recognizing the heavy load that the law is, and that it is, but it is only for a particular period of time. But with Jesus, we have now someone who says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so you see this kind of a contrast. And I think a lot of the legislation, and I touch on this in the book, a lot of the legislation in the Old Testament that is very, in a sense, heavy-handed, very, it seems, wow, this is really weighty, it's really detailed and so forth. This often comes in response to people's disobedience, priestly disobedience and so forth. So it's sort of God's response to their disobedience by, okay, if you're going to act this way, I'm going to plop more laws on you that you need to pay attention to. And it's as though the people aren't going to live in the freedom that God gives. And so you even have in the beginning of the law of Moses kind of a general sketch of laws, but it's not the kind of, this covenant code. In Genesis 20 to 23, it's not that kind of heavy law code, but the people, when they come to Mount Sinai, they don't want to actually be a holy priesthood and royal nation. They said to Moses, you speak to God. We don't want to speak to him, and so forth. So they're kind of distancing themselves from God in the first place. So again, I talk about some of those things in the book, and it's just helpful to see all of this in its kind of narrative perspective, and also to make sure that yes, of course, we don't want to jump to we don't want to make that is-ought fallacy. But on the other hand, we can see as the scriptures move forward that there are certain things that are happening that we ought to say, wow, that's all of a sudden this kind of a strong legislation that comes, but it's often in response to the people's disobedience, like the heavy priestly regulations after Aaron has made the golden calf. And so forth. There are other rebellions in Numbers and Leviticus and so forth, and goat idols and so forth. And so there's legislation that then becomes much more heavy for the people as a result of their disobedience.
Amen. I think that the is-ought fallacy, you mentioned it also, it comes up later on in your book. It comes up, I had a conversation on Jephthah's daughter a couple of weeks back. And I think that's a perfect case and scenario is ought. And, where Jephthah, of course, and I was glad that you mentioned it. You said some Old Testament scholars argue that Jephthah's daughter didn't literally sacrifice his daughter. But most, however, are convinced that the text asserts this, then, of course, you say, oh, okay, well, the worst case scenario, let's talk about that. And
right.
And I think that Jephthah is a classic case is where sometimes and we would impose upon Yahweh the guilt of what one man did of his own accord. And right. Even if he did sacrifice his daughter and basically burn her alive, that is a case, an example, I think, of what you mentioned later on. You said critics should be careful about assuming that Jephthah or Samson was in peak moral condition, and we can surely find a lesson, this is later on, find a lesson in here somewhere about how God works despite human sin and failure. So even though Jephthah was a man of God, and I think that we fail to realize is that even though he was a man of God, he was still a sinful human being. David was God's apple of his eye, and yet he fell into sin. And so we're talking about people that, yes, they may be filled with the Holy Spirit, just like we are filled with the Holy Spirit, and I'm sure we all fail in some way. my former Lutheran self is that we all fail in word and deed. We commit sins of attrition and commission, and so it's a case in point where the Bible is not really hiding the fact that there were great men of God who fell into really, really grave sin and put themselves in precarious positions, and that's not God's fault, and that's not Yahweh's fault. It is just a case and example of, see this man, he was a great man of God, but these are things that we can also learn from by his errors so that we won't commit the same type of errors. I would say that the error of Jephthah is counting the chickens before they hatch, or writing I always say, write a check that you can't cash. And so that would be kind of the moral of his story, and with deadly results.
Yeah, and you're right to point out that even in the New Testament, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul speaks about how Israel's rebellion and idolatry and grumbling and so forth, engaging in sexual immorality. That he says that these are lessons for us to learn. That we are to learn from their negative example. And it's also a reminder for humility, too, that he says, if anyone thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. That these things have been written down for our example, but don't think that, if I lived back then, I wouldn't have done those things, or I'm so much better than they are. We need to remember that the same sorts of temptations exist. We need to remember that we need to walk in the grace of God and trust in his Spirit and not be presumptuous and confident in our own selves. We know that we need to depend upon God and learn from those negative examples that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 10.
I'm glad you mentioned the New Testament because, and you mentioned this in your book about Ananias and Sapphira, and that really goes on to show you that, if you think that the Old Testament, this was only happening in the Old Testament, we have cases, an example in the New Testament, where people were violating God's laws and being struck dead right there on the spot. Ananias and Sapphira are a case in point. Not only that, but I thought about it and I was like, in the book of Corinthians it talks about believers falling asleep in death because they took communion in an unworthy manner. So who's to think that this stuff was only happening in the Old Testament? It was happening right there amongst the Christian congregations, where some would fall, some would get sick, and because they took communion and did not view it holy. And some, the fortunate ones were the ones that were just sick, but some, it says, fell asleep in death. And then it brings me back to what you mentioned about Nadab and Abihu, of course, the Leviticus account of strange fire, where God had exacting justice upon them because they were not holding the sanctity of worship, holy. And Uzzah is another example. So the things that were happening in the Old Testament were also happening in the first century church, and we have examples of it. But I think that people are selective about that, aren't they?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you see, for example, even in as you go on in Acts 13, there's Elymas the magician, whom through Paul's pronouncement, God strikes him blind because he is resisting the gospel, the proclamation of the gospel. Or Jesus himself, when he's speaking to the church at Thyatira, he's talking about the this Jezebel, false prophetess, and Jesus says, this is Jesus speaking, he says that I'm going to cast her on a bed of sickness. I cast her on a bed of sickness and gave her time to repent, but she refused. So here's Jesus causing her to be sick, and he says that he is going to, he's going to strike dead her followers, her children. This is Jesus speaking in very severe terms. So he himself is kind of like with the Corinthians. He is talking about striking dead those who are engaged in this false teaching. So it's really what Paul is saying. There is this continuity between the Old and New Testaments, and Paul says in Romans 11:22, he says, "Behold, the kindness and severity of God." I think a lot of us want to emphasize the kindness, but we forget about the severity. And when we look at the book of Hebrews, it's very interesting that in Hebrews chapter 2, it talks about under the law that every crime, every sin received its just penalty. And then it goes on to say, how much more for us if we neglect so great a salvation. So basically, if you thought it was harsh in the Old Testament, it's really harsh if you reject the gospel. And we see that kind of an emphasis in Hebrews chapter 10, in Hebrews chapter 12, where our God is a consuming fire. That if God when he was speaking on earth, from earth, was this fierce, and Abraham was full of fear and trembling, and the people didn't want to come near. Again, how much more if we neglect him who speaks from heaven? So again, it's a very strong language here that doesn't negate or downplay the severity of the Old Testament. In fact, says it's even more severe. And so that is something that is often lost in much of the teaching that is being discussed today. That the gospel holds us to a greater account. That there's that the consequences are not just temporal or corporal, but these are ones that are of they're of eternal weight and so forth. So that's something that is definitely often overlooked in, I think, some of the trends that are taking place today, even within the church.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus himself warns. He says, "Do not fear those who can kill the body, but fear him who can destroy, apolume, who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna." So here he makes a distinction. He's saying, you think biological death is bad, the biological cessation is not the thing you really need to fear. Anybody can do that. What God can do, though, he can destroy both soul and body in a place called Gehenna or hell, depending on translation. So, I mean, even Jesus warns us of a fate even worse than death itself, that is biological death.
Yeah, that's right.
I want to open up the lines. If you're listening in, and the number is 347-934-0379. We don't have Dr. Copan much longer, so press 1 if you have any questions for Dr. Copan on this book, Is God a Moral Monster, or the topic of the Old Testament. Maybe you believe that Yahweh is the devil. I hope that maybe in some of the conversation we've had that we may have dispelled some of the views that you may have had or ideologies you've been infused with. But if you are atheist or neo-Marcionist, or you just pretty much just are not too crazy about the Old Testament God, and there are certain particular texts that you take issue with, please press 1. The number is 347-934-0379, and we don't have much longer for Dr. Copan. But I mean, I really appreciate this book, and I'm continuing to read it with Hoffmeyer's book, and I had just finished reading Lamb's book, and you actually gave some really additional insight. I'll tell you what I really my favorite subject, or my favorite story, is the prodigal son. And you gave me a whole new insight into the prodigal son by going through Deuteronomy. I believe it's Deuteronomy 21, I think. I got. Let me look at my notes here. I made so many notes. I could never sell this book again. Some people sell used books because I've made so many notes in this book, and I really think that this is a good thing. Deuteronomy 21:18-21, the glutton and the drunkard, and you gave me some additional insights into this text because Yeah, this is one of those things that people do have an issue with, talking about a bunch of parents that take their son and for him to actually, if he doesn't listen to them, that he would be killed. And and it really, the prodigal son is a good example of the that was, of course, a last resort, but this, what Deuteronomy is speaking of, is someone who is not responding to discipline, someone who is a disgrace to the family, and someone who could probably bring the family to ruin, which is what the prodigal son probably is giving us an excellent model for, because we know that the prodigal son, he got his inheritance. And if he would have had his way, he would have ruined his entire family's inheritance. If they would have gave him every penny, he would have ruined it all. But fortunately for the prodigal son, he spent all his money on gluttony and drunkenness and God knows whatever else, type of lascivious living that he had, and he realized his tragedy sitting in the pig pen with a bunch of pigs. And so I think that Deuteronomy, it was a great full circle by applying that to the prodigal son that you did in your book. And I really can't wait to read the rest. And so anyone want to press one? I always tell my listeners, because they always wait till the last second to press one. But I do. Yeah. I hope that more Christians will have this book. It'll equip them. Also, not only will it equip them. Oh, somebody's pressing one. There you go. All righty. 920. You're on the air.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hear you loud and clear.
Okay, this is Bonnie. This is Bonnie Wilbur. Gus, do you remember me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know where to start. I've been listening to the whole program, and I did read his book. I don't know where should I start with slavery, sacrifices.
We don't have a whole lot of time, so maybe just pick one question.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's lots of scriptures in the Bible, where it shows that slavery, men could sell their children to slavery, and women were not allowed to go free. If the owner of the slave, and I'm not going to call it a servant, it was a slave. If he was provided, if the guy came in with a wife, he could leave with his wife. But if the owner provided the man, his slave, with a wife, then the wife belonged to the owner and the children. And if they took slaves from the nation, they were inherited. They went from generation to generation. They were not allowed to go free, which is absolutely not what you said in your book. In your book, you make it look like it was voluntary and it was servitude. That's not true at all.
Well,
that's not true, and you know it. If you're a scholar.
That's quite a charge, and I think I would temper that a bit, because even the language, as when there is the language of someone who has to sell his daughter, so to speak, into servitude, this is because someone is too poor and can't manage it on his own, and so has to parcel out his family members within, say, the clan. Also,
did you see that anywhere in the Bible? Where is that said, that reason? Where is that located?
Well, it's for one thing, it's located in the Law of Moses, where someone who he can't poverty is what creates servitude, and that's why you have indentured servitude, and there is a cap on that, as you know from Leviticus 6, that there's a term limit to it, and the prophets, when the you have Amos and Jeremiah, when people are overextending the statute of limitations on servitude, if they go beyond the limit that is set in the law of 6 years, then they're exploiting them and taking advantage of them, and the prophets are saying you are not allowed to do that. There is a term limitation here, but yet you're taking advantage of them. So I mean,
that only applied to the Jews, don't you? And it only applied to the men.
I did,
the women were not allowed to go free, and you know that. It says it right in Exodus chapter 21, verse 7.
Right, and I talk about that. The judges are able to make distinctions between male and female, and they just happen to. And again, I go into a lot of detail on that, so I don't know why this is becoming such an issue. That because it could just as well apply to a male who stays behind because he is under contractual obligation.
You know very well that the male stayed behind because he was provided a wife from the master. And he had a family and a wife, and that is the only reason he stayed behind. If he came in with his wife and children, he was allowed to go free with his wife and children. That only applied to the Jews. You know, it did not apply to the nations. You know that. You did not address that in your book.
Okay. Well, I already just talked about the nations, and I talked about Leviticus 25, which is what people typically go to, and I mentioned that a lot of people ignore verse 47 of Leviticus 25, where this person who is apparently in Israel as a stranger or alien, he can become a person of means. So much so that he could even enlist an Israelite servant to work for him. And so, a lot of people just kind of stop at the other, at verses at 46, and then go on beyond that. And so I'm saying, why don't you keep reading the text, and you can see that those who are in servitude actually could become persons of means, such that they can even have an Israelite servant for them. So again, I won't go into. We're out of time here. I do talk about these things in the book. I'll be working on a second edition, and so just stay tuned. But I think you should temper your charges a little bit. You are, I think, accusing me falsely. And
I did read your book, and you left a lot out. You are an apologist. You're not looking at the Bible neutrally.
Well, I don't think any of us looks at the Bible neutrally. The question is,
I think we all should. If your people's lives are at stake, read the Bible, and you should look at the Bible neutrally. You should not look at it as an apologist.
Well, I think that Jesus himself took a view of the Old Testament, and I think he speaks with authority. He obviously speaks with authority, and that authority was vindicated in his resurrection. And so he is one who has a high view of the Old Testament, and so I certainly see myself in that tradition.
He did, and Paul contradicted him.
Pardon?
He did,
okay,
but Paul contradicted him.
I think we're running down a bunch of rabbit trails here, so I think we should probably just wrap this up.
All right. Thanks, Bonnie, for calling in. Well, Bonnie's an atheist, Dr. Copan, and so and I think that you're right, that we all don't come to the Bible with neutrality. Some of us come with certain biases.
She certainly doesn't.
Yeah, no, she doesn't. And as an atheist, of course, she wouldn't. And that's the whole point of the first chapter, where you're addressing new atheists, because of course, new atheists come with emotion and not with really scientific. They claim to be men of science, but they actually come with a whole lot of passionate emotion, and we're seeing some of that from Bonnie there, instead of having a conversation or a discussion. Well, I just want to thank you for coming. And so you said you're writing a second book on this topic, then?
Yeah, I'm going to be working on a second edition. It'll probably be out in a few years, but I've got to chip away at that. I've got a couple of projects that I'm wrapping up now, but then I'll devote myself to a second edition. So stay tuned.
Okay, because I'm like, oh, wait a minute, you let the cat out of the bag there.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, that's what I would like to do. I keep on getting thwarted, so don't be discouraged. I mean, the first book has a lot of stuff in it that I think is worth digesting, and I'm just going to be, if anything, I'm just going to be adding to what's there, and so anyway.
So, well, maybe it won't be a second book. Maybe it'll be a larger volume, a second edition, maybe.
It'll be a larger volume, a second edition. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would think. Yeah. All righty. Well, thank you so much for coming on the broadcast today. And you have a blessed day. And I hope that more Christians will get this book, and I think it will really inform them a lot about the Old Testament, things that most Christians don't know, but also it will afford them and equip them against some of the arguments that skeptics and atheists and neo-Martionists would possibly assault them with the Old Testament, because I know it's equipped me a lot more, especially to see some of the Old Testament in the New Testament, such as parables of the prodigal son that you provided there. So God bless you and your work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gus. Great to be with you.
Thank you. I hope I'll get to see you at one of those conferences.
Sounds good. All right, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. So just want to inform everyone, okay, that's the end of today's podcast. But next Saturday we're going to have a debate. And so I want to invite you all to come on at next Saturday at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, where William Albrecht and Territon Fan will have a debate on the issue of purgatory. So that will be, of course, a 2-hour debate. And Territon Fan is from Alpha and Omega Ministries, and William, of course, is from the Catholic Legate. And we will have that debate on the doctrine of purgatory. So you all have a blessed day, and this will be going up on YouTube sometime this week or next week. You all have a great day, and subscribe to us on YouTube, Healing X Outreach. Bye-bye.